Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, I wanted to say something quickly about what's going on in France, in Paris. I'm sure everyone is aware that there are riots, there's protests, the city is on fire. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that, because I don't know if there's a strategy, if any of these protests are tactical in terms of pursuing a specific objective. Is the objective to repeal the pension law that extends the retirement age, or is the objective to topple the government of Macron? What's the objective? And whatever the objective is, how exactly, tactically, strategically, do these protests serve that objective? Because the way it looks to me is that there is organic opposition, and that organic opposition was gauged prior to Macron making the decision to push that bill through without parliamentary approval. That opposition was already gauged, so they knew that the population was more or less unanimously against this bill, and that there would be outrage if the bill was passed, if the bill was pushed through. And once that was gauged, Macron pushed the bill through. So it looks like this was provoked deliberately by the government. And it looks to me like this is part of the destabilisation that I've been talking about for the last year, the destabilisation in Europe, that is part of the US proxy war against Europe, that has been launched via the war in Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia. My suspicion is that there are intelligence agencies involved, US, European, French intelligence agencies involved in misdirecting the protests to make them more violent, to make them more disruptive, to make them more destabilizing. Then the protesters will be labeled as Russian-backed. You see here, there's French protesters singing an old Russian song, Katyusha, which is highly suspicious to me. This looks like something that was orchestrated to me, because now you're making it very easy to label protesters as Russian sympathizers or being Russian-backed. That they're infiltrated by Russian agents, so that then the protesters and then the population can be cracked down upon further. Now, this is very similar to what we've seen in other parts of the world, and in Latin America and in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, and with specifically in Syria. So what we would normally expect to see, the pattern normally, would be for the police to violently crack down on the protesters in order to generate more violence from the protesters, in order to generate greater polarization, greater militancy, greater extremism, so that then violent groups can emerge in France against the government, who will likely be armed by some of the the deliberately untracked weapons, small arms, that were sent supposedly to Ukraine, but nobody knows where they went. That these small arms will proliferate throughout Europe and very possibly fall into the hands, well, not fall, but be directed into the hands of organized militant groups in countries like France and potentially in countries like Germany, just to foment greater instability, greater disruption, greater chaos. And Macron is going along with this plan because, as I've said before, he doesn't work for the French people. He works for the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, in whose interests it is to destabilize Europe, because anyway, Europe is falling from its relevance on the global stage in terms of its demographics, in terms of its population, in terms of its centrality to the international marketplace. As I've said before, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital have identified that Europe is now primarily going to be useful as a conflict zone. So my suspicion is that yes, there is organic, there is real opposition in France, but what typically happens is that that natural grassroots, real organic opposition is manipulated and is exploited for the aims and the agendas of those in power, whereby they are made more violent, they're made more extreme, they're made more radical, they're made more militant, so that you can essentially establish a police state where there is ongoing conflict within the country. And Allahu Alam. But the way it looks to me is that the protest movement, the legitimate protest movement, has been derailed in France and is becoming just a source of turmoil and chaos. And that always looks to me like something that is being orchestrated by the state and those who own and control the state. And Allahu Alam. Jazakum Allahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.